Hi, I wanted to kind of run over the last section of kind of the global conflict, which has to do with the focus on the Middle East. Now, the Middle East, that conflict really, I mean, sorry, that's my Yorkshire. Um, the Middle East conflict, Darcy, sorry. Uh, okay, I think he's done now. I almost stopped the video. Anyways, so what you have is going back to World War II. So really, you could go back to World War One, the mandates, all this kind of stuff. World War II happens. You have Hitler made some inroads into the Middle East, kind of following the British model around World War One. Kind of reached out to some of these Arab countries, Arab tribes, and even places like in Egypt and that sort of thing. So one of the things you have to understand is that when you get to the end of World War II and you have this movement towards a creation of Israel, and I have an interpretation that kind of says it was done in part because of kind of a collective guilt around the Holocaust. Some people suggest that it wasn't really about that. That really it was kind of one of those things where you just got this movement of people to agree. Regardless, we know that Israel is created 1948, and it's kind of carved out of this area of Palestine by this United Nations agreement. Again, we have lots of partitions taking place between Arab areas, Palestinian areas, all this kind of stuff. And I think the problem is the partitions don't work. If you're talking about Korea, if you're talking about Vietnam, if you're talking about Germany, if you're talking about the Middle East, they don't work. Because people are more complicated than that. And so what ends up happening is you have this period of tension. Now, right off the bat, there's an Arab-Israeli war. The Israelis managed to hold off largely with a lot of support from the United States. You have a Suez crisis in 1956. The U.S. kind of basically encourages Israel to back off. So you've got this perception that the U.S. and the Israeli relationship is very hand in glove, and I don't know that that's entirely accurate. I mean, it depends on the specific situation and that kind of thing, but you definitely have a perception by Arab nations and other non-Israeli nations that the U.S. really kind of supports the Israeli agenda. 6-Day War happens in 67. Again, Israel's attacked. They don't do the attacking. They're being attacked by Syria and by Jordan and that kind of thing. And they push them back. That's going to happen again in the Yom Kippur War. And I shared some videos with you in the inquiry that talk about the Yom Kippur War and the fact that Nixon sends assistance and that kind of thing. And so this begins to create this sense of this frustration with the United States in relation to its Middle East policy. So you want to kind of have a sense for this building frustration. You also want to have a sense that there was this kind of flirtation with kind of military strongmen that really goes back to this period after World War One, influenced by kind of World War II. And what will happen is there's going to be part of the rise of fundamentalism and extremism in the Middle East is tied in part to a sense that the military approach hasn't worked, right? It didn't work in 67 with Israel. It didn't work in 73 with Israel. And so there's kind of this sense that maybe this is a religious issue, right? This is people aren't being true to their faith, and that's why, they've been abandoned and all this kind of stuff. And it's into this that you have the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. OPEC comes in. They decide to punish the United States for our support of Israel in 1973 with an embargo that crashes the oil, makes oil prices go really high. And you have to understand that the U.S. had become increasingly dependent on foreign oil, beginning after World War II. During World War II, we produced our own stuff. Then with the 1950s, we want cheap goods, cheap gas, lots of cars, suburbs, highways, all that kind of stuff. And we start depending on oil from the Middle East because it's much cheaper, it's much easier to get. And by the 1970s, as we're coming out of kind of this spending hangover, for lack of a better term, where we've spent so much on the Great Society programs and we've spent so much on Vietnam and trying to make sure the economy is healthy, and yet into this, they shut off the oil. And so we'd already been dealing with some price inflation. We'd already been dealing with kind of some sluggish economic indicators, and they jack up the price of oil. And all of a sudden, overnight, everything's expensive, except it's not expensive in the sense that it's going to result in a common sense, okay, so people lose their jobs, prices fall. That's not what's happening, because it still costs a lot to make stuff and move stuff. So prices stay high even as unemployment goes high. And so that creates this economic crisis that's happening. So part of what will happen in relation to this is that, as Egypt, as the Middle East, as we come out of the tensions in the mid-1970s, Jimmy Carter will benefit and be able to bring together Israel and Egypt and create the Camp David Accords, which is this peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. And this is a huge thing. It's a huge step in the right direction. To kind of bring peace to that region. And so he does this. Now, unfortunately, of course, Anwar Sadat is assassinated shortly afterwards. And it's into this that you start to have the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. So, and again, some of that goes back to the 1950s and the Cold War stuff. We helped overthrow a democratically elected leader in Iran who was kind of interested in nationalizing the oil company. We put the Shah of Iran in place, and he was kind of a dictator. And then the Shah gets sick, and he comes to the United States for medical treatment. And the U.S., and the Ayatollah takes over, and you have kind of the rise of this theocratic government in Iran. They hold American diplomats hostage for a little over a year. So that hostage crisis looks pretty bad. I shared a specific video on that. It's into this that you're going to have the Lebanon War. Lebanon invites the United Nations in as peacekeepers, and you begin to have the rise of kind of terrorist activity. So kind of beginning in many ways with the Beirut bombing of the Marine Corps barracks. And this is only going to continue throughout a series. You have the 92, 93 attack on the World Trade Center, where, it filled the trade centers with smoke, right? That's often seen as kind of the precursor to 9/11. We had the USS Cole that was attacked in the Persian Gulf in the late 90s. And it's into the midst of all this that you have the Persian Gulf War. Of course, the Persian Gulf War has to do with Saddam Hussein trying to take over Kuwait. And so that creates issues there. So then the U.S. is basically invited by Saudi Arabia to get involved. But we're also concerned about Saddam Hussein being territorially expansive, just like we saw with Hitler, right? And so we want to put a stop to that. And so we take those actions of the Persian Gulf War. That creates resentment of the U.S. presence in the Middle East, particularly with somebody like Osama bin Laden. And so all of that's going to ultimately lead to the 9/11 attacks, right? And of course, the irony is a lot of those attackers were Saudis. Again, Saudi Arabia, we have a difficult relationship with them. Sometimes they're our allies and sometimes they aren't. And so we have a difficult relationship with them. And that's where a lot of the attackers came from. And of course, all of this gets tangled up with Afghanistan and the Mujahideen. We had helped equip the Mujahideen against the Soviets, and that yields to the Taliban later on. And so then you have this issue with Iran. We have continuing issues with Iraq. Once Saddam Hussein is defeated in the Persian Gulf War, then we have all these years of tension with him. And then this concern that he's building nuclear weapons or biological weapons. And so we continue to have these hot spots in the Middle East. The 2003 war in Iraq led to kind of a broad authorization of power against the war on terror. So that still sometimes gets used to justify military action, say like the attack on Soleimani and that kind of thing. So a lot of different kind of things taking place in the Middle East. So this is just kind of a really super fast overview. Just know that it really kind of starts beginning with this creation of Israel. you've really got a couple of hot spots: the creation of Israel and the area around Israel and Palestine. You've got the issue with Iran, right? And in the midst of this, kind of the Camp David Accords kind of calms things down around Israel for a little while, but then we have the issues with Iran. And so it's just like we're constantly dealing with those different problems. So even really the extension of Saddam Hussein in Iraq is really kind of the product of us trying to pit Iran and Iraq against each other in the 1980s. Just lots of kind of complicating factors. So just know that the U.S. Policy in the Middle East is not simple. It's not a straight line. You can't just go from one event to the other. There's all these little, paths, kind of like a cartoon. And so just know that there's a lot of complicating factors. I think the inquiry will kind of help you see how all of that goes. But I did want to give you a little bit of that intro and overview.